Hi, and welcome back to another online lecture here in world history. Today we're going to wrap up our unit on the Age of Exploration by looking at how the Spanish Empire weakens. We really started this unit by looking at the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch, and how they led the way in sailing innovations and trading. But we can also learn some very important economic concepts from looking at how the Spanish really made some bad decisions with their policy and with their government, ultimately with their spending as well, and almost led to the collapse of the Spanish Empire. They don't completely fall apart, but they come pretty close. So I think this is a nice way to wrap up our unit. So we have one constructive response question we're going to look at. The question says, identify the reasons Spain's empire nearly collapsed. And we're actually going to look at 5 different things that led to the near collapse of the Spanish Empire. So what were we going to learn here today? Well, our story is going to start with Charles V. This is the same Charles V that we saw in the film Luther. He was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of Germany at the time. So we're going to revisit his story because he's ultimately going to lead us to Philip II of Spain, who is his son. And so Philip II is going to be kind of the main person in this story, especially when we get to something called the Spanish Armada. So we're going to talk about how the failure of the Spanish Armada really was a sign of things to come for Spain, and then we're going to look at the 4 reasons the Spanish Empire weakens. So that's our roadmap to learning today. So we're going to start with this. We've got a map here of the Habsburg Empire of Charles V. The Habsburgs is a family we haven't spoken too much about yet. Very, very famous family that owned a lot of property. So the Habsburgs clearly owned Spain. They owned a little bit of what would become France. They owned the Netherlands, parts of Italy, Austria. I mean, they were the family with the most wealth and power in Europe. So definitely it's important for us to understand that. Now here's Charles V. We've actually seen him before because he was in the film Luther, as you can see here. Not the best picture, but I had mentioned him in the movie and I kind of made a comment about his haircut, and I did that intentionally because the filmmakers of Luther did a very good job of casting him. This is what the real Charles V looked like. Very, very close to what Charles V was depicted as in that film. So let's start by talking about who he was and why he fits into this story. So setting the stage with Charles V. So Habsburg King Charles V had inherited Spain, Spain's American colonies, parts of Italy, lands in Austria, and the Netherlands. That was that map that we just looked at. The only thing missing on that map, of course, were Spain's American colonies. And when you have that much land, you have all the trade that occurs there, you have all the taxes that are coming in, all the gold and silver that they had access to in the American colonies. So this is going to make Charles V very, very wealthy. So he's doing very, very well for himself. He was elected Holy Roman Emperor and ruled much of Germany as well, just kind of adding to his lands that he controlled. And we know that he was a very devout Catholic, and this is going to connect to our story on Luther. So devout means very, very strong. So he's a strong or devout Catholic who sparred with Martin Luther, but eventually signed the Peace of Augsburg, which allowed Protestants to have their beliefs. So if you remember the end of that film, where those German princes stood up to the emperor, they were standing up to Charles V, and he allowed them to keep their beliefs. He could have cut their heads off there, could have ended Protestantism, but instead he allowed them to keep those beliefs, and we have the Catholic and Protestant church today. So definitely a connection back to our previous unit. Following the Peace of Augsburg, he divided up his territory and he decided to retire to a monastery. So his empire did not remain intact, and that's going to matter here because the next part of our story is going to focus mostly on Spain and the Netherlands. So how it got split up was this. His brother Ferdinand got Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, which is 2 pretty good pieces of land. However, you save the best land for your son, and that's exactly what he's going to do. So his son Philip II inherited Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, and all of the American colonies. These are 3 really wealthy pieces of property. So son Philip actually got the better end of this deal. And that's going to matter because naturally we're going to talk about Philip next. Philip is a leader of Spain, and he's very, very Catholic, just like his father. And he's going to really challenge Spain to try to promote more Catholicism. But in the end, he's actually going to bring about the first of the big problems that plague Spain that ultimately leads to their empire weakening very severely. So let's talk about a powerful Spanish empire under Philip II. So, as I mentioned, Philip II, like his father, is deeply religious. He's very, very Catholic, and he continues to try to promote the Catholic Church. He's very hardworking, but he wasn't exactly the easiest guy to work with. He was very suspicious of most people, and he didn't trust people for very long, which is going to lead him to be a little bit paranoid. Now, he's going to be able to add more land to his kingdom because he sees an opportunity. I make the suggestion in my course that it always sort of shocks me that Portugal and Spain never were united, as if one would have taken over the other. This is the closest it ever happens. So when the Portuguese king died without an heir, Philip seized the kingdom for Spain, which included all of their strongholds in Africa, India, and the East Indies. Long story short, Philip does not take over all of Portugal in the end of this, but he does get a lot of the land that Portugal had claimed. So he's basically just adding to his territory around the world. Adding colonies and adding territory was something many different monarchs or kings in Europe wanted to do. So he's just making Spain that much stronger in the process. Of course, Spain's land brought in tons of wealth. And this brings in the idea of mercantilism, which we talked about with our previous lesson on the Columbian Exchange. Mercantilism suggests that the more wealth you have, the more power you have. And I think this still rings true today. Look at politics. I mean, you can't run for president if you don't have a lot of money to campaign. It costs a lot of money. Look at the money and wealth that Bill Gates has. He has a lot of influence and a lot of power because he's got a lot of money. So mercantilism is just that idea that the more wealth you have, the more power you have. And that's what the European kings wanted. The more colonies you had, the more opportunity you had to gain gold and gems and diamonds and whatever else. So that added to your wealth, which of course made you more powerful in the end. So that's how all of that fits together. Continuing on here, to kind of prove why you wanted this land, each shipload of treasure brought in was required to give the king between 1/4 and 1/5 of their cargo, which of course allowed Spain to have a lot of different things, including an army of over 50,000 soldiers. So you always have to pay your king sort of a tax. If you go out and find all this gold and all this silver and you come back, you got to give some of it back to your king. But think about it, you're still keeping anywhere from 3/4 to 4/5 of your cargo. You're still making a lot of money in the process, and so is your monarch, your king or queen. So it's very mutually beneficial for both the explorers and for the kings of Europe. Philip became a defender of Catholicism throughout this story. Basically what happens is Philip creates the Spanish Armada in 1588. A little background information on what's going on here. Philip had proposed marriage to Queen Elizabeth of England. In fact, he was married to her older sister, Bloody Mary. If you remember that story when we talked about that last unit, Bloody Mary was very Catholic, Philip's very Catholic, and he wants England to remain Catholic. But we know that Queen Elizabeth does not do that. She turns England back into a Protestant country with the Anglican Church. And so he doesn't like that. He's not a big fan of that. But he had tried to work things out with Elizabeth, proposed marriage to her. She never really answered him properly, and he got very, very impatient. And so his plan was, I'm going to go take out Protestant England. I'm going to go punish them for being heretics, for being Protestant. So he creates the Spanish Armada in 1588. Well, Armada is a fancy word for a giant fleet. It's a lot of ships. So it's a huge Catholic fleet of Spanish ships. That sounds sort of like a mouthful. A giant fleet of all these Spanish ships sailing under basically the idea of Catholicism, because King Philip is Catholic. And their plan was to punish Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I. He was not happy with the fact that she was using a new faith, and he was not happy that she had basically ignored him, so he wanted to go after her. Well, he's unsuccessful. The Spanish Armada should have been able to take out the English Navy and been able to invade England, but they don't. They were basically defeated by two things. One is weather. Weather was really bad that day. A lot of Philip's ships were anchored and eventually were pushed into rocky shores where a lot of them shipwrecked. But one of the other things the English used, and I have under here, the fleet was defeated by English tactics. The English tactic was fire ships. They literally lit their ships on fire and sailed towards the Spanish. Now, this wasn't necessarily done completely for devastation to try to destroy the Spanish ships, although that did happen. Most of it was done to break the Spanish lines so that the English could come in and effectively attack. But in the end, it's those fire ships and weather that defeats the Spanish Armada. Why is this significant in history? Well, Spain was going to be severely weakened by this. I mean, anytime you lose ships, you're going to lose money, you're going to lose obviously your ships, you're going to lose soldiers. It's a very costly endeavor. So Spain was seriously weakened by the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but they weren't done yet. They still had great wealth that would give Spain strength for a short while longer. So the Spanish Armada is definitely a failure under Philip, and it's one of the reasons that the Spanish Empire is eventually going to weaken. This doesn't weaken it completely yet, but it's just going to be the first in a series of different events that bring down the Spanish. So here's an image here. You've got Philip on the left. You've got Elizabeth on the right. In the middle, you see the ships fighting. I mean, it's a portrait, so it doesn't give you a great view of it, but it does show you the fighting between the Spanish and the British. Another image here, you can see the fire ships coming in and attacking the Spanish here. So that's where we're going to end part one. In part two, we're going to talk about 4 economic reasons that the Spanish Empire ultimately weakens. It starts with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but we're going to see 4 economic changes that hurt the Spanish. So that's where we're going with part two. So you can go ahead and hit stop here and queue up part two.